Now class, let's go through a couple of validity coefficients. I want to review this for you because this is going to come up a lot in the class. So, a validity coefficient class is a correlation between your predictors, such as personality traits, and outcomes of interest. So, let's look at a real-world example from a paper by Judge and collaborators, looking at the effects of personality on career success over a span of 50 years class. So we have here childhood measured personality traits and subsequent career success. Now, extrinsic career success class is career success that is more objective, yeah? How many times have you been promoted? How high have you gone up the organizational hierarchy? Is your job prestigious? And so on. Intrinsic career success is more subjective. So subjectively, are you satisfied with your career? Yeah. And so here we have the correlations of these big five traits with these outcomes. Now, the validity coefficients that don't have an asterisk class are not statistically significant. Now, for those of you who don't have a very strong stats background, it basically means these are indistinguishable from zero. So, agreeableness, for example, did not really predict career success in any meaningful way. Yeah, these are indistinguishable from zero. Now, the asterisks show that these are quite distinct from zero. So there are genuine effects of conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness to experience. Now, here we see that conscientiousness is the strongest predictor of both types of career success, yeah, at approximately zero point 0.4. Now, what does that mean, class? This validity coefficient is basically a correlation between conscientiousness and intrinsic career success. Now, zero point 0.4, or rather positive zero point 0.4, tells us that the relationship is positive. So the higher the conscientiousness, in childhood, the more intrinsic career success the person has, and it's about moderately more. Not a lot more, but moderately more. We say that a correlation of between zero point 0.3 to zero point 0.5 is moderate, less than zero point 0.3 is low, more than zero point 0.5 is pretty strong. Yeah? So there's an approximately moderate relationship between conscientiousness and career success. Now, one other thing, class, to bear in mind with validity coefficients is that they have one very important and useful additional purpose. They will tell you how much of your criterion is explained by your predictor. And how you do that is you square the validity coefficient. So in this case, zero point 0.4 squared is 0.16. Turn that into a percent and you get 16%. That means 16% of people's differences in their career success can be explained by conscientiousness. You understand, class? So 16% of the variation in the criterion depends on the variation in the predictor. Just 16%. It's not that much, but it is meaningful. Now compare that to emotional stability. Yeah? In this case, we have about zero point 0.2 of a validity coefficient here. 0.2 squared is 0.04 or 4%. That means 4% of the variation in intrinsic career success can be explained by emotional intelligence. Now, class, note the difference. Conscientiousness predicts career success approximately. The difference is not that substantial, but as you can see, because we're squaring them, conscientiousness is predicting 16%, while emotional stability is predicting only 4%. This is why you want a high validity coefficient, class, because they scale exponentially. The extent to which these coefficients predict your criteria is going up exponentially. Zero point 0.2 squared is 0.4. 0.4 squared is 16% instead of 4%. Yeah? So higher validity coefficients can make a huge difference. Okay, now let's move on to how we assess personality. There are three broad categories that we will consider, class. Yeah, first is the personality inventory, which is basically a personality questionnaire. Now, these can be self-report, in which you answer questions about yourself, or an informant report in which you answer questions about your colleague. Yeah, or an informant report in which a lecturer answers questions about their student, or an informant report in which you answer questions about your supervisor, in the case of 360-degree feedback. Yeah. So informant means someone informing on you and about your personality. Next, we have projective tests. Now, projective tests are contrasted with personality inventories in one important way. Personality inventories are explicit. You can roughly guess what exactly is being measured in a personality inventory. Yeah, we are asking you to uh, uh, report on yourself in a way that is explicit and obvious. In a projective test, it is implicit and non-obvious. How this works, class, is that respondents or job candidates are presented with ambiguous stimuli, yeah, like ambiguous pictures or incomplete sentences, and then they're asked to explain or interpret or fill in the stimuli. The idea being that these vague and unclear stimuli become blank canvases upon which you can project your true personality. Think like a Freud class. It's a very Freudian approach. Freud came up with this notion of projection. Yeah, so these should have one advantage over normal personality inventories, and that they are less prone to faking generally, because you don't really know what you're being tested on, and all you're being given is a vague stimulus to interpret. The trouble is that these don't predict performance. They don't predict the things we care about. They're not consistent. They are problematic, unlike the personality inventories that seem easy to fake and seem obvious. Oddly enough, these are the ones that work. Yeah, and then we have the use of interviews and behavioral assessments to get at personality. So you can, through the process of an interview, approximately work out how conscientious a person is, for example. Now, I'll save the discussion of this for the lecture on interviews. Now, let's look at personality inventories, class. These can be either paper and pencil or computerized. Now, class, unlike cognitive ability testing, personality testing over the computer is fine. No issues. So you want to measure personality over like a web-based remote platform, that tends to not be problematic. It tends to work about as well, unlike cognitive ability testing, which when done over the computer is prone to loads of issues, including having someone sit the test for you, etc., etc. Yeah. Next, these inventories are multi-dimensional, class. So rarely will you see a personality inventory only assessing conscientiousness. They will assess a whole host of traits, yeah, that are of interest for the job. And these tests are developed using factor analysis. It's the same technique I mentioned earlier, which is that early personality researchers had people describe others using a long list of adjectives and look for statistically coalescing buckets. Yeah, so buckets of variables that kind of come together based on the statistical patterns. Yeah, so it's an algorithmic approach to identifying underlying personality structure. And there are many of these tests available, typically proprietary. So there are companies that develop tests for various kinds of jobs where well, at least they claim that their tests predict outcomes of interest for these jobs. Now, one of the most common of these is the OPQ, the Occupational Personality Questionnaire. Now, you'll remember, class, when I discussed the prevalence of various selection procedures, that the OPQ is actually pretty well, I mean, as far as personality testing goes, it is pretty popular here in Australia, yeah? And this questionnaire measures 32 personality traits that predict various different criteria. Yeah. So a question, class, might look something like this. Choose which of the four statements is most and least true of you. I am the sort of person who leads the team, is confident with new people, plans ahead, can sell a product, etc. So this is a kind of extroversion related item. Next, we have standard Big Five measures class, yeah, like the NEO. There are also Big Five type measures that are more specific to various industries, more specific to various contexts that have been developed by various test developers. Mm. Now, here are some sample items for extraversion. Class, I have to keep correcting myself. Extraversion. For extraversion, one sample item might be I tend not to say what I think about things. This is a reverse item, so you would score this in reverse. The higher you score on this item, the less extroverted you are. And by default, the more introverted you are. Mm. Agreeableness. I tend to be trusting of others. Conscientiousness. I approach most of my work steadily and persistently. Emotional stability. Whenever I'm by myself, I feel vulnerable. Now, class, again, this is a reversed item. Lastly, we have openness to experience. I enjoy eating in new restaurants I know nothing about. And my goodness, class, with all this coronavirus stuff going on, I certainly miss eating out. And I'm sure you do too. Let's continue. Now, integrity testing is a sort of specific case of personality testing that asks questions that have to do with honesty. Yeah? And in fact, there is a proposed alternative to the Big Five, which is the Big Six, also known as the Hexaco. Yeah. Now I don't. The hexaco is not examinable. I don't cover it in the unit, partly because it's not in the textbook, and so I don't want to create added confusion over something that's not examinable. Yeah. So I won't get into this very much, other than to say that the Big Six model proposes these five personality traits plus an additional H factor called honesty, humility. Yeah. So there are six ways by which we evaluate and understand others, including honesty and humility. Yeah. This is often added to these personality inventories. Now, this can be used as a way of measuring integrity, class. Now, the idea here is that certain antisocial counterproductive behaviors like theft, dishonesty, vandalism, etc., can be predicted by personality as well. Yeah, counterproductive work behaviors can definitely be predicted by personality. And the testing for this is typically integrity testing. So this can include testing for things like honesty, humility, yeah, or you can use another underlying bunch of items that kind of get at integrity. Yeah. So basically, there's a common personality pattern underlying these bad behaviors, yeah, that can be identified. Now, unfortunately, these tests are not very transparent. So it often is fairly straightforward to tell what you're being tested on. And so one alternative, often class, is to just measure conscientiousness, agreeableness, and emotional stability. Yeah? These three factors roughly capture the person's integrity or likelihood to not engage in counterproductive workplace behavior. So if you want to be less obvious about how you test for integrity, just measure these three. Okay, now let's get to the projective tests. Now, the most popular of these class, I do want to emphasize, overall, they have questionable reliability and validity. Let's recap. Reliability, consistency. Do you get the same score on the ink blot over time? Validity, does it correlate with criteria that we pardon me, I hope that's not a coronavirus cough. I think it's not. Anyway, the extent to which it correlates with things, outcomes that we care about, like performance, like teamwork, like counterproductive workplace behaviors. Projective tests have pretty crap validity and even worse reliability. So, you may have heard of the Rorschach ink blot class. This is a set of some, I believe, 20 ink blots, where you are presented a vague stimulus like this and asked to, well, basically explain what this is. The thinking being that, again, in a very Freudian stance, that people project their personalities, yeah, their needs, their desires, their ways of being onto this stimulus. Yeah, again, it doesn't quite do what it says on the tin, and like responses to Rorschach tests tend not to be consistent, not consistent across ink blots, not consistent across people. It isn't very good at what it's meant to do. Then we have the thematic apperception test, the TAT. This is another golden oldie class. So how this works is that people are presented with evocative but ambiguous pictures where you can tell there's something going on, and you have to kind of tell a story based on this. So what's going on here? Is the lady angry at the man, or is the lady crying because the man is kind of mean, or are they both grieving over the loss of a child, etc., etc.? So build a story, build a narrative around this ambiguous figure. Yeah, now these projective tests class try to solicit narratives. Yeah, so what a participant, or rather what a job candidate would produce, is a narrative that explains what's going on here, specifically asked to explain what's happening, who was involved, what led up to the situation, what people are thinking and wanting, and what will happen next. Now there is a scoring code for various desires and psychological needs. Class, I don't know what to say, class. The scoring schemes for these things, while apparently strict, are surprisingly vague. I have had the experience of trying to score thematic apperception test responses, and like the scores that I would give are often not the same as the scores that my colleagues would give. Um, and yeah, it just does not predict the things we want it to predict. Now, if only this actually worked, it would be great, right? It would be a nice, unobtrusive, non-obvious way to get that personality. It just doesn't work. Yeah. Now we have incomplete sentences. Now these have a little more substance to them, and specifically the minor sentence completion scale has has some evidence of predicting manager performance ratings. So it does seem to be consistent, and it does seem to do what it says on the tin. Now here we have a 0.35 validity coefficient. Yeah, so it's explaining approximately 0.35 squared, which is off the top of my head maybe 12. So about 11 or 12% of variance in manager performance ratings, which is not bad. Yeah, so how this works is you're given a bunch of incomplete sentences and told to fill in what comes next. When playing cards, I dot dot dot, yeah, running for political office dot dot dot, wearing a necktie dot dot dot, and so on and so forth. So the idea there is that there are scoring schemes for the open-ended responses that people make to these sentences, and these can be used to assess various managerial motivation traits. Okay, now class, in personality testing, there is a lot of junk. There's a lot of crap out there. Now, what makes a personality test work? Now, you have the toolkit for this class: reliability, content validity, criterion validity, and construct validity. Let's apply these to some rubbish forms of personality testing. First is reliability. Do you get consistent results? Well, many of these tests don't give you consistent results. People vary enormously in how they respond to things like the thematic apperception test. Even on like a weekly basis, they'll vary. So how do you expect to assess something about people that will last over the span of their tenure at work? It's not realistic. It doesn't make sense. So projective tests just give inconsistent responses, inconsistent over time, inconsistent from item to item. So how people respond to one panel versus another panel that are supposed to capture similar things, the consistency just isn't there. Class, the Myers-Briggs type inventory is also notoriously inconsistent. Yeah, so people claim to have certain categories like, say, INFJ or something. Yeah, um, these tend to change pretty markedly over a fairly short span of time. It's just not consistent. And even like the items that measure, say, well, I think introversion is fine, but the items that measure, say, N, which is intuitiveness, tend not to be very consistent even with each other. Yeah, so there is a lack of consistency, and measures that are not reliable tend to have more noise, yeah, than actual signal. Yeah, and signal is the stuff that matters for the firm. This is the stuff that actually generates value for the company, not the noise, and yet this is what tends to be measured by these unreliable tests. Next is content validity. Is it measuring the full scope of what matters for someone's personality? Yeah, so content validity is, does it cover the content it's supposed to cover? Now, the Myers-Briggs type inventory is based on a kind of approximate model of personality as Carl Jung envisioned it and as adapted by Myers and Briggs. Class, there is now, okay, I don't know how much you know about the Myers-Briggs, yeah, but broadly it tries to measure, are you introverted or extroverted? Are you sensing or intuitive? So I guess, are you more big picture or do you look at little details? Judging and perceiving, are you kind of finicky about things? Are you like a kind of a stickler, or are you more like free form? And then thinking or feeling, do you prefer to think or do you prefer to feel? This is the one that I've least understood because I don't know, most human beings I've met are both thinking and feeling creatures. We all have cognition, we all have emotions. I don't get why this dichotomy exists. That aside, and which by the way is an issue for criterion validity, it just doesn't make sense. But setting that aside, we're talking about content validity here, class. So this is supposed to capture the entirety of a person's personality. Now, class, this MBTI model is missing one thing. It's missing the most important predictor of work behavior. What do you think it is, class? It's missing something. The MBTI is missing something big and obvious. Something I have been alluding to repeatedly in this lecture. Class, the MBTI does not capture conscientiousness. It does not capture the extent to which people are reliable, dedicated, and orderly at work. There's nothing in the MBTI that captures this. Not at best only obliquely. Yeah, that's why the MBTI does not predict outcomes of interest at work. It's incomplete. It's fundamentally incomplete, class. The DISC is similarly problematic. This is another model of people's approach to work, whether they're dominant or steady, compliant. It's again, it's very incomplete. It's missing obvious things that matter for people at work that just aren't captured in this model. It's incomplete. Then there's criterion validity. Does it predict the outcomes that matter? The MBTI does not. Neither does emotional intelligence, class. You would think emotional intelligence would predict consequential things like leadership ability and sales performance. No, it does not, especially once you've controlled for actual cognitive ability, as I discussed in the previous lecture. And lastly, construct validity. Class, when I drew this line, it was meant to go here, the construct validity. So, this forming an artificial divide between thinking and feeling does not capture how people actually operate, how people actually are in the world. When we think, we feel. People who think are also people who feel. And so this artificial line is not really, it is artificial. It is not true to anything that is inherent to the human condition and how people genuinely vary from each other. Yeah? It does not show up in any of the natural language studies, any of the factor analysis, trait theory studies that led to the Big Five. I mean, frankly, if it did, then this would show up in the Big Five, but it did not, class. So generally, construct validity is, do the dimensions map out the way they're supposed to? Often, if you take a Myers-Briggs type inventory test and run a factor analysis on it the way you would with a Big Five, you don't find the buckets working neatly like this. And the buckets, like true and false, might be not interpretable. Grit class has the same problem. Now, you may have heard about grit. There's been TED Talks about it, how what matters for people at work is not whether or not they're smart, but whether or not they have the passion and persistence to pursue long-term goals, also known as grit. Now, this sounds good on paper. The problem is, class, that grit does not do what it says it's supposed, or it does not do what it claims to do. Yeah? So if you look at a measure of grit, a questionnaire of grit, it's supposed to measure two things: your passion for pursuing long-term goals and your persistence for pursuing long-term goals. Passion and persistence. But if you look at the factor analyses and if you look at the outcomes, it's only persistence. It's not passion. Yeah, so it's not doing what it says it does. Now, if you want to measure persistence, hey, guess what? I've got a measure for you. It's called conscientiousness. It's already there, class. This is old wine in a new bottle. Yeah? Been there, done that. Nothing new in grit. The bit that is new and interesting does not work. So these are the things to consider when you look into getting personality measures for your staffing needs. So first, is it consistent? Consistent over time, consistent across items, consistent between raters, etc., etc. Next, does it measure everything it's supposed to measure? And does it do so with high fidelity? Does it predict the outcomes of interest, like performance? And lastly, does it do what it says on the tin? Does it map out the way it's meant to map out? Yeah, is it true to the phenomenon in the real world? Now, class, that's where we stop for now. In the